18-year-old Caleb Mitchell stood at 5'9", weighing barely 140 pounds, soaking wet. He had absolutely no business stepping between three aggressive college athletes and a hulking, leather-clad biker. Yet that split-second decision didn't just almost cost Caleb his life, it unleashed the Hells Angels. Dusty's Diner sat like a forgotten relic on the shoulder of Route 99, just outside the sun-baked limits of Bakersfield, California. It was the kind of place where truck drivers and weary travelers stopped for black coffee and greasy burgers, a purgatory of cracked vinyl booths and flickering neon. For Caleb, it was just another shift in a life entirely defined by scraping by. He worked buzzing tables and washing dishes, funneling every meager paycheck straight to his mother Sarah to keep the lights on in their crumbling trailer across town. Caleb wiped down a sticky table near the window, ignoring the throbbing ache in his feet. The diner was nearly empty, save for the hum of the ancient air conditioning unit and the low twang of country music from the jukebox. It was a Tuesday afternoon, suffocatingly hot, and the parking lot asphalt radiated waves of distortion. That was when Joseph Callan walked in. Everyone in the local biker community knew him as Bear, a moniker he had earned not just for his staggering 6'5", 280-pound frame, but for the fierce protective loyalty he brought to the local Hells Angels charter. Today, however, Bear didn't look like a fearsome enforcer. He stumbled through the glass double doors, his heavy leather cut emblazoned with the iconic death head patch hanging off his broad shoulders. His face was entirely devoid of color, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. Caleb watched as the giant man staggered toward a corner booth, gripping the edges of the tables to keep himself upright. Bear's breathing was shallow and erratic. He collapsed into the booth, his head rolling back against the vinyl. It wasn't intoxication. It was severe diabetic shock. His blood sugar had plummeted on the highway, forcing him to pull over before he crashed his Harley-Davidson. Now his organs were beginning to shut down. Before Arthur Pendleton, the elderly diner owner, could grab a menu, the front door jingled open again. In walked Troy Dawson and his two shadows, Greg and Liam. Troy was the star quarterback at the local community college, the son of a wealthy Bakersfield developer and a young man entirely accustomed to the world bowing at his feet. He and his friends were loud smelling of cheap cologne and day drinking, radiating the kind of arrogant entitlement that usually spelled trouble for people like Caleb. Troy's eyes immediately locked onto Bear. Troy had a long-standing irrational hatred for bikers, mostly stemming from an incident where his father's pristine Porsche was clipped by a rogue rider years ago. Seeing a Hells Angel in a state of absolute vulnerability was to a bully like Troy like blood in the water. "Well, look what we have here," Troy sneered, swaggering over to Bear's booth. "One of the big bad 1%ers. Looking a little pathetic today, aren't we, Grand-Dad?" Bear barely registered the insult. His vision was tunneling his hands, trembling violently as he fumbled in his pockets, desperately searching for the glucose tablets he knew he had forgotten at his clubhouse. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped his throat. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Troy snapped, slamming his hand onto the table. The sudden noise made Arthur jump behind the counter. "You guys think you own the roads. What's wrong? Forget how to ride." Greg snickered, emboldened by Troy. He reached out and violently flicked the winged skull patch on Bear's chest. "Maybe he wants to buy us a drink." "Leave him alone," Caleb muttered. The words slipped out before his brain could stop them. Troy turned, slowly eyeing the scrawny teenager in the grease-stained apron. "What did you say, busboy?" Caleb's heart hammered furiously against his ribs. He was terrified. Troy had tormented him relentlessly through high school, shoving him into lockers and mocking his thrift store clothes. Caleb knew exactly how vicious Troy could be. But looking at the massive, helpless man gasping for air in the booth, something inside Caleb snapped. He couldn't just watch. I said, "Leave him alone." Caleb repeated his voice, louder this time, though it trembled. "He's sick. Can't you see that? Mind your business, trash," Troy warned, stepping away from Bear and closing the distance to Caleb. "Go wash a dish before I break your jaw." To emphasize his point, Troy turned back and shoved Bear hard in the shoulder. The big man slumped sideways, completely incapacitated, sliding off the slick vinyl seat and crashing heavily onto the linoleum floor. Bear lay there gasping, his eyes rolling back. Troy laughed, pulling his foot back to kick the fallen biker in the ribs. He never made the connection. Caleb threw his entire meager weight forward, tackling Troy's legs. Both teenagers crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. It was a completely mismatched fight from the very first second. Troy recovered instantly, his athletic frame easily overpowering the skinny diner worker. "You stupid little punk," Troy roared, driving a heavy fist directly into Caleb's cheekbone. Pain exploded across Caleb's face, white-hot and blinding. He tasted copper as his lip split open. Greg and Liam cheered, circling like hyenas. Caleb tried to scramble up, positioning his body as a physical shield over Bear, who was now barely conscious on the floor. Troy kicked Caleb in the ribs twice. Caleb screamed, curling into a tight ball, but he utterly refused to roll away from the dying man beneath him. He took the brunt of a heavy steel-toed boot to his shoulder, wrapping his arms around Bear's head to protect the biker from the assault. "Stop, the police are on their way!" Arthur shrieked from behind the counter, waving a landline phone like a weapon. "I called the cops, they're coming right now." The distant rising wail of sirens cut through the diner. Troy froze. A police record would ruin his college football scholarship, and his father wouldn't be able to buy his way out of an assault charge with witnesses. "You're dead, Mitchell!" Troy spat, wiping a drop of sweat from his forehead. "Watch your back!" The three athletes bolted out the front door, their tires squealing as they fled the parking lot. Caleb remained on the floor, gasping through the agonizing pain in his ribs. He looked down at Bear. The biker's eyes flickered open for a fraction of a second, his hazy gaze locking onto the battered, bleeding teenager who had just taken a severe beating for him. 10 minutes later, the paramedics loaded Bear onto a stretcher, hooking him up to an IV of dextrose that immediately began pulling him back from the brink of a diabetic coma. As the ambulance doors prepared to slam shut, Bear weakly raised a massive calloused hand toward Caleb, who sat on the bumper of a police cruiser, holding a bag of frozen peas to his rapidly swelling eye. It wasn't a wave. It was an acknowledgement, a promise. 3 days passed in agonizing slow motion. Oppressive California heat showed no signs of breaking, and neither did Caleb's misfortune. Every breath was a sharp, stabbing reminder of the brutal encounter on the diner floor, his 2 bruised ribs protesting any sudden movement. His left eye was ringed in deep, ugly shades of purple and yellow, a visible testament to his sudden plunge into violence. Sarah, his mother, had wept openly when she saw him, begging him to go to the emergency room. Caleb had stubbornly refused, masking his fear with false bravado. They simply didn't have the insurance or the cash for x-rays, and every penny was already earmarked for rent. Popping over-the-counter painkillers and taping his ribs tight against his torso, he returned to his grueling routine of work and night classes, bearing the weight of their survival on his narrow shoulders. If Caleb thought Troy Dawson would let the humiliation slide, he was tragically mistaken. Troy was furious, his ego fragile and venomous. He had been forced to run from a nobody, a scrawny busboy he considered utterly beneath his wealthy athletic pedigree. At Bakersfield Community College, where Caleb scraped together credits for an associate's degree, Troy made it his absolute mission to reassert his dominance. He stalked the hallways with his cronies, casting dark, threatening glares waiting for the perfect moment to strike when witnesses were scarce. It culminated on a Thursday evening in the dimly lit campus parking lot. Caleb was exhausted, unlocking his battered 10-speed bicycle, his vital only mode of transportation, between the diner school and the trailer park. Suddenly, a heavy hand gripped the back of his collar, lifting him off his feet and slamming him violently against a rough brick wall. Caleb gasped, the air rushing from his bruised lungs as his bike lock clattered to the pavement. Troy was there, eyes blazing with malicious intent, flanked by Greg and Liam. The lot was mostly deserted, bathed in the sickly flickering yellow glow of a single sodium street lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. "Thought you were a hero, didn't you?" Troy hissed, pressing his heavy forearm directly against Caleb's throat, pinning him. "Thought you could embarrass me in front of my friends and just walk away. I didn't do anything." Caleb choked out his hands, weakly grasping at Troy's thick arm. "You got in my way?" Troy growled, his face inches from Caleb's. "You protected a piece of biker trash. Now I'm going to teach you a permanent lesson about where you belong in this town." Troy stepped back, a cruel smirk forming as he nodded to Greg. Greg eagerly picked up Caleb's bicycle, lifted it high over his head, and brought it smashing down onto the concrete curb. The sickening sound of bending aluminum and snapping steel, spokes, echoed through the empty lot. Greg mercilessly stomped on the front wheel until the rim folded entirely in half, rendering the frame useless wreckage. "Walk home, hero," Troy sneered, dusting off his hands. "And if you ever cross my path again, I'll put you in the hospital next to your dead biker boyfriend." They sauntered away, their cruel mockery piercing the quiet night. Caleb slid slowly down the rough brick wall, pulling his knees to his chest. He stared blankly at the mangled wreckage of his bicycle. Without it, the delicate house of cards that was his life would collapse. He couldn't get to work on time. Without work, eviction was a certainty. Tears of profound frustration and physical agony pricked his eyes, but he wiped them away furiously with a grimy sleeve. He was entirely alone, crushed under the weight of a rigged system. Across town, a completely different kind of justice was assembling at Bakersfield Memorial Hospital. Joseph Bear Callan was finally discharged. The severe diabetic episode had required days of heavy stabilization, but the giant biker had fought his way back. As he walked out the sliding glass doors of the lobby, he was greeted by a sight that commanded absolute respect and fear. 24 customized Harley-Davidson motorcycles lined the hospital curb in perfect formation. The men leaning against them wore heavy, road-worn denim and black leather, their cuts proudly displaying the California rockers and the imposing, infamous death head patch. At the absolute center of the pack stood Michael Henderson, universally known as Iron Mike. Mike was the president of the Bakersfield Charter, a man whose quiet, measured demeanor hid a fiercely calculating mind and a ruthless, unwavering dedication to his brotherhood. Bear approached his brothers, exchanging firm handshakes and hard embraces that spoke volumes without a single word. "Good to have you back, brother," Mike said, his voice a low gravel rumble that commanded instant attention. "Doc says you almost didn't make it this time. You were fading fast." "I wouldn't have," Bear replied, his expression turning deadly serious as he looked over his club. "I went down hard in a diner, out on Route 99. Some college punks decided to use me for target practice while I was completely blacked out." A collective dangerous shift in posture rippled immediately through the gathered angels. Brows furrowed, massive jaws clenched. Disrespecting a patched member was an offense that demanded immediate, overwhelming, and often brutal correction. "We have a name?" Mike asked softly, his eyes turning cold and flat. "I'll find out," Bear said firmly. "But that's not the priority right now. He paused, looking down at his massive calloused hands, remembering the hazy image of the boy above him. There was a kid working there, scrawny little guy. He threw his own body over me, took a brutal, merciless beating from 3 grown athletes just to keep their boots off my head. He didn't know me. I'm a Hell's Angel, and he still put his young life on the line to save mine. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with unspoken understanding. The club operated on a strict, unbreakable code of honor. If you wronged them, retaliation was swift. But if you bled for them, you were owed a debt that superseded all other laws. The club owes him, Mike stated, a simple declaration of absolute fact. I owe him my life, Bear corrected, stepping toward his motorcycle. I need to find him immediately. Tracking down Caleb was effortless for the Hells Angels. By Friday afternoon, Bear knew Caleb's name, his bleak financial reality, and the crucial fact that the teenager was currently walking 5 miles home because his primary transportation had been violently destroyed. Caleb was trudging along the dusty, unforgiving shoulder of an industrial bypass, his backpack incredibly heavy, bruised ribs screaming with every step. The sun was setting, casting long, lonely shadows. He kept his head down, consumed by despair. Before he heard the mechanical roar, he felt it in his bones. A low, rhythmic vibration traveled up through the soles of his worn-out sneakers, shaking the asphalt. Caleb stopped, turning around with a sinking heart. Coming down the empty road, moving in a tight, disciplined diamond formation, were 20 Hells Angels. The synchronized roar of their engines was deafening. Caleb's blood ran completely cold, paralyzing terror gripping his throat. He assumed they were coming to finish the job the college kids started. He was trapped against a chain-link fence, completely vulnerable. The pack slowed, surrounding him in a flawless circle of gleaming chrome hot exhaust and massive men. The engines cut out one by one, leaving a heavy silence. Bear kicked his stand down and walked toward Caleb. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for a devastating impact. Instead, 2 massive hands gently gripped his shoulders. Caleb opened his eyes. Bear was looking down at him, his hard features softened by profound gratitude, noting the black eye and the pained posture. You took a bad hit for me, kid, Bear rumbled softly. Without another word, the giant Hells Angel pulled the terrified teenager into a crushing embrace. Realization finally washed over Caleb. He was safe. Bear stepped back. "Brothers," he called out. "Meet Caleb, the boy who saved my life." 20 hardened men simultaneously nodded their heads in deep respect. "I heard you had a long walk home," Bear said, handing Caleb a spare black helmet. "And I heard some local trash broke your ride. Put this on. From today on, you never walk alone in this city again." Sarah Mitchell rushed out onto the precarious aluminum steps of their trailer, her hands flying to her mouth. She saw the terrifying array of bikers, the gleaming chrome catching the harsh amber glow of the streetlights, and then she saw her bruised and battered son climbing off the lead motorcycle. "Caleb!" she cried out, her voice frantic as she ran down the steps. Bear stepped forward, removing his helmet. Despite his massive, intimidating frame, his voice was surprisingly gentle when he addressed her. "Mom, your son is a brave young man. He took a severe beating, trying to protect me when I was having a medical emergency. I owe him my life." Sarah stopped, her eyes darting between Caleb's bruised face and the giant biker. She pulled Caleb into a desperate hug, weeping into his shoulder. Bear reached into his heavy cut and pulled out a thick envelope, holding it out to Sarah. "We know Caleb's bicycle was destroyed today by the cowards who attacked him," Bear stated softly. "This is for a new ride, and for anything else you might need right now. Rent, groceries, medical bills." Sarah stared at the envelope, shaking her head. I can't take your money. It's not charity, Mrs. Mitchell. Iron Mike, the charter president, said, as he stepped forward, his cold eyes softening just a fraction. It's a debt repaid. In our world, a debt of blood and honor is absolute. You take it, and you know that from this day forward, your family is under the protection of the Hell's Angels. Over the next few weeks, the reality of that protection became a terrifying silent wall around Caleb. He bought a reliable used Honda Civic, with the money leaving enough left over to pay off 6 months of their trailer park rent. But the real change was invisible to most, yet glaringly obvious to those who paid attention. Troy Dawson, utterly furious that his intimidation tactics had seemingly failed, tried to escalate his campaign against Caleb. He cornered the teenager in the community college cafeteria, ready to publicly humiliate him again. But as Troy raised his hand to shove Caleb's tray, a massive bearded man in a leather vest casually stood up from an adjacent table. The biker didn't say a word. He simply folded his newspaper, crossed his heavily tattooed arms, and stared Troy down with a look of pure, unadulterated menace. Troy swallowed hard, lowering his hand. He backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. Over the next week, Troy noticed them everywhere. A lone biker parked across the street from his fraternity house. 2 men in leather cuts drinking coffee at the booth next to Caleb's at Dusty's Diner. The Hell's Angels were orchestrating a suffocating psychological siege, letting Troy know that his prey was completely untouchable. Infuriated and feeling his absolute authority crumbling, Troy went to his father. Richard Dawson was a ruthless real estate developer who practically owned the town council. He was a man entirely accustomed to solving problems with a phone call and a discreet campaign donation. Some biker trash is harassing me, Troy lied to his father in his expansive glass-walled office. They're stalking me because of some kid from the diner. Richard Dawson picked up his phone, his face red with indignation. He called the local police chief, demanding a task force to crack down on the motorcycle club and threatening to pull his funding for the upcoming mayoral race if his son wasn't protected. The retaliation from the Hell's Angels was not violent. It was entirely surgical, devastatingly precise, and rooted in hard karma. Iron Mike was not just a street brawler. He was a master tactician who understood that men like Richard Dawson were built on foundations of sand and dirty secrets. The club's vast network of associates included paralegals, disgruntled bank tellers, and private investigators. Within 48 hours, they had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Richard Dawson's operations. On a quiet Wednesday morning, Iron Mike walked into the exclusive Bakersfield Country Club. The wealthy patrons fell dead silent as the imposing biker bypassed the maitre d' and walked directly to Richard Dawson's regular breakfast table. Mike dropped a thick manila folder directly onto Richard's plate of Eggs Benedict. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard sputtered, his face turning an angry shade of purple. "I'll have you arrested for trespassing." "Open it!" Mike commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying enough authority to freeze the air in the room. Trembling, Richard opened the folder. Inside were detailed, irrefutable documents proving years of embezzlement, illegal kickbacks from city contractors, and severe zoning violations that endangered hundreds of local residents. It was enough evidence to put the wealthy developer in federal prison for a decade. "Your son is a bully who violently assaulted a kid trying to save a dying man," Mike said evenly, leaning over the table. "You raised a coward, Richard, and now you are going to learn about accountability. You will call off the police chief. Your son will never look at Caleb Mitchell again. If I hear even a whisper of a threat against that boy, these files go directly to the FBI and the local press simultaneously." You will lose everything." Richard Dawson went completely pale. The arrogant veneer of authority shattered instantly. He nodded weakly, unable to meet the biker's cold stare. Autumn winds brought a chill to the Bakersfield air, but they did nothing to cool the simmering rage inside Troy Dawson. His father had suddenly and inexplicably grounded him, cutting off his credit cards and forbidding him from going anywhere near Caleb Mitchell. But Troy was too arrogant to understand the invisible forces at play. He felt humiliated, stripped of his power, and he blamed Caleb for all of it. Determined to exact his revenge and prove he was still the apex predator on campus, Troy planned a final brutal ambush. He waited until a Friday night when Caleb was working the closing shift at Dusty's diner. Troy didn't bring Greg or Liam. He wanted to handle this himself. He parked his lifted truck 2 blocks away and walked through the dark alleys, gripping an aluminum baseball bat tightly in his hands. Caleb walked out the back door of the diner at midnight, tossing a heavy bag of trash into the dumpster. The alley was pitch black, illuminated only by a single flickering bulb above the exit. "Hey, hero," Troy's voice hissed from the shadows. Caleb froze. He turned to see Troy stepping into the dim light, the baseball bat resting menacingly on his shoulder. "You ruined my life," Troy spat, taking a slow step forward. "My dad is treating me like a prisoner. My friends think I'm a joke because I let a scrawny busboy get the better of me. That ends tonight." Caleb didn't run. Over the past few months, knowing the angels were watching over him had fundamentally changed his posture. He stood tall, looking Troy directly in the eyes. "You ruined your own life, Troy. You just finally picked on the wrong people." "Shut up!" Troy screamed, raising the bat high above his head and charging forward. Before Troy could swing, the deafening roar of a heavy engine shattered the silence of the alley. High-beam headlights suddenly flooded the narrow space, blinding Troy completely. He skidded to a halt, raising his arm to shield his eyes. A massive black pickup truck blocked the end of the alley. The doors opened, and 5 Hell's Angels stepped out, heavy, steel-toed boots crunching against the gravel. Bear was leading them. Troy dropped the bat, his tough guy facade instantly evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror. He turned to run the other way, but Iron Mike and 3 other patched members stepped out from behind the diner's dumpsters, completely boxing him in. "We told your father to keep you on a leash," Iron Mike said, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "Seems he doesn't have any control over his own house." Troy fell to his knees, sobbing openly, begging for mercy. The arrogant quarterback was entirely broken, thoroughly humiliated in front of the teenager he had tormented for years. "We don't hit kids," Bear said, stepping over the dropped baseball bat and looking down at the weeping athlete. "But we do believe in hard karma. And we believe in exposing rats." Red and blue lights suddenly strobed against the brick walls of the alley. 3 police cruisers pulled up, sirens blaring. Arthur Pendleton, the diner owner, stepped out of the back door holding his phone. "I caught it all on the new security cameras you gentlemen helped me install," Arthur said to Bear, nodding respectfully. "Clear video of him trespassing with a deadly weapon attempting severe bodily harm." The police, fully aware of the irrefutable video evidence, slapped handcuffs on Troy Dawson. As he was dragged away to the cruisers screaming for his father, Iron Mike pulled out his phone and made a single call. By the time the sun rose on Saturday morning, the devastating files detailing Richard Dawson's vast corruption network were sitting in the inbox of every major news outlet in California and the regional FBI field office. The retaliation was absolute. The Dawson empire crumbled overnight. Richard was indicted, his assets frozen, and his political influence entirely vaporized. Troy, facing serious assault with a deadly weapon charges and stripped of his family's wealth, lost his football scholarship instantly. The Bullies were permanently dethroned, their abuse of authority exposed to the glaring light of public scrutiny. A month later, the atmosphere at the Hells Angels clubhouse was vibrant and loud. A massive barbecue was underway, the smell of roasted meat and gasoline hanging heavy in the air. Caleb sat at a picnic table laughing as Bear clapped him on the shoulder, nearly knocking the breath out of him. Sarah was a few tables over, smiling warmly as she conversed with some of the club members' wives. Caleb no longer worked at the diner. The club had helped him secure a paid apprenticeship at a high-end automotive garage, recognizing his natural mechanical aptitude when he worked on his Honda. He was excelling in his college courses, his tuition fully covered by a mysterious, anonymous community grant that Iron Mike had organized. Caleb looked around the compound, taking in the sight of the fiercely loyal men and women who had stepped out of the shadows to protect him. He had risked everything to save a stranger, expecting nothing but pain in return. Instead, he had found justice. He had found a family. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would never walk alone again. Did this incredible story of unwavering loyalty and hard karma keep you on the edge of your seat? Justice always finds a way when the unexpected step up to protect the vulnerable. If you loved this dramatic tale of brotherhood and retribution, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories delivered straight to your daily feed.